The legacy of complexity and the questions that haunt the Braun family's post-war story reveals a pattern fundamentally different from the families of Himmler, Goering, Mengele, or Heydrich, because Eva Braun herself held no official position in the Nazi regime, signed no orders, participated in no documented crimes, and her primary historical role was as Hitler's companion and eventual wife. This creates a moral complexity that the other Nazi families don't present as starkly. How guilty is someone who loved a monster but didn't themselves commit monstrous acts? And, by extension, how much responsibility do the relatives of that person bear for a connection that was personal rather than political, romantic rather than ideological? The Braun family's various responses to these questions, Ilse's defensive denial, Gretel's silence and withdrawal, and the parents' refusal to speak publicly, all represent different strategies for dealing with a guilt that is real but ambiguous, undeniable but difficult to quantify. Eva Braun chose to be with Adolf Hitler, chose to stay with him when she could have left, and chose to marry him and die with him in the bunker, rather than face a world that would judge her harshly for her association. Those were her choices, and history rightly holds her accountable for them. But what about her family who didn't choose Hitler, who were simply related to a woman who made terrible decisions about whom to love? The question becomes even more complicated when we consider what the Braun family actually knew about Nazi crimes and when they knew it. There's substantial evidence that people in Hitler's immediate circle, even those who weren't directly involved in policymaking, knew about concentration camps and understood that terrible things were happening to Jews and other targeted groups. Eva Braun lived at the Beerhof, where Hitler's inner circle gathered, where men like Himmler, Goering and Goebbels visited regularly, and where conversations about the war and Nazi policies certainly occurred. It strains credibility to believe, as Ilse claimed, that Eva knew absolutely nothing about the Holocaust, though it's possible she didn't know the full scope and industrial nature of the genocide until very late in the war. The Braun family parents and sisters, who visited the Berghof regularly throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, were similarly exposed to enough information that willful ignorance, rather than complete innocence, seems the most likely explanation for their claimed lack of knowledge. This willful ignorance, the choice not to ask questions, not to investigate rumors, not to confront uncomfortable truths about what the Nazi regime was doing, represents a form of complicity that falls short of active participation in crimes, but still carries moral weight. As we reach 2024, merely 80 years after Eva Braun's death, the question of her family's legacy remains unresolved in important ways. Eva Barbara's descendants, Hitler's potential grandchildren, if the paternity rumors were true, live somewhere in Germany or possibly abroad, their identities protected and their positions on their family history unknown. Gretel's second husband's family, the Berlinghofs, presumably includes step-descendants who carry the Braun family story as an inherited burden they didn't ask for. Or distant Braun relatives, cousins, nephews, nieces of Fritz and Fanny, likely exist and carry the knowledge that they're related to the woman who married Adolf Hitler, though whether they acknowledge this connection publicly or privately is unknown. The pattern across all these descendants appears to be silence, privacy, and withdrawal from any public association with Eva Braun or Hitler, which is understandable and arguably the most ethical response available to people who bear no personal guilt for historical crimes. But this collective silence also raises questions about historical memory and accountability. When all the direct witnesses are dead, when the last generation with personal memories of Nazi crimes passes away, what happens to our understanding of complicity, collaboration, and the ordinary people who enabled extraordinary evil through their choices to look away, to remain silent, to prioritize personal loyalty over moral courage? The Braun family story doesn't provide easy answers because they genuinely occupy a morally ambiguous space. They weren't perpetrators, but they were connected to the ultimate perpetrator through bonds of family and love. They didn't commit genocide, but they lived comfortable lives funded by a regime that did. They probably knew something was wrong, but they chose not to know too much, not to ask too many questions, not to confront truths that would have required them to make impossible choices between family loyalty and moral clarity. This is the banality of complicity, the ordinary human failure that allows extraordinary evil to flourish. And the Braun family represents millions of Germans who made similar choices during the Nazi era, to varying degrees. The Braun family story proves that loving a monster doesn't make you one, but choosing silence over truth, comfort over moral courage, creates its own form of guilt that descendants carry for generations. Eva Braun chose Hitler. Her family chose not to reject that connection, and their descendants chose disappearance, each generation making different choices about the same impossible legacy, reminding us that complicity has many faces and accountability has no statute of limitations. Deaths. Hermann Fegelein was arrested by the SS for attempting to desert Berlin and flee to neutral territory. He was found in his Berlin apartment with a mistress, large amounts of cash, and jewelry, apparently planning to escape before the Soviet army captured the city. Hitler, enraged by what he saw as betrayal, ordered Fegelein's immediate execution. On April 29, 1945, Hermann Fegelein was shot by firing squad in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, making Gretel Braun a widow at age 29, while she was 8 months pregnant with their first child. What happened next to the Braun family? To Gretel, who gave birth just weeks after her husband's execution and her sister's suicide. To Ilse, who tried to defend Eva's reputation while denying any knowledge of Nazi crimes. To Fritz and Fanny, who watched their daughter become Hitler's wife in the final hours before their joint suicide, reveals the impossible position of families connected to evil, not through their own actions, but through the choices of relatives they preserve, loved. The Braun family didn't participate in the Holocaust, didn't hold positions of power in the Nazi regime, and by most accounts knew little about the specific crimes being committed in concentration camps across Europe. Yet their proximity to Hitler through Eva and Gretel's marriage to an SS general who certainly knew about and participated in Nazi atrocities made them complicit in the eyes of many and forced them to reckon with a legacy they never chose but could never escape. On May 5th, 1945, just 5 days after Hitler and Eva's deaths, and 6 days after her husband Hermann Fegelein's execution, Gretel Braun gave birth to a daughter in a hospital in Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. She named the baby Eva Barbara Fegelein, with Eva honoring her deceased sister. But almost immediately, a rumor began circulating among Hitler's surviving associates, and later among historians and journalists. Was Hermann Fegelein really the father of this child? Or was Adolf Hitler himself the biological father? The timing of the pregnancy, the close relationship between Hitler and the Braun family, and some ambiguous comments made by people in Hitler's inner circle fueled speculation that has never been definitively resolved. Gretel always maintained that Hermann was the father, and there's no concrete evidence to prove otherwise, but the rumor has persisted for nearly 80 years, making Eva Barbara Fegelein one of the most controversial figures in the post-war Nazi family landscape. If the rumor were true, it would mean Hitler had a biological child who survived him, a daughter who lived into the 21st century, carrying the Führer's genes, a possibility that horrifies some and fascinates others, though most serious historians consider the evidence insufficient to support the claim. What we know for certain is that Gretel faced an impossible situation in May 1945. She was a 29-year-old widow with a newborn baby. Her sister and brother-in-law had just committed suicide. Her husband had been executed for desertion, and American forces were occupying Bavaria and arresting anyone connected to the Nazi regime. On May 10, 1945, just 5 days after giving birth, Gretel was arrested by American Counterintelligence Corps officers and taken for interrogation along with her parents, Fritz and Fanny Braun. The Americans wanted to know everything about Eva's relationship with Hitler, about what the Braun family knew regarding Nazi crimes, and about the final days in the Führer bunker. Though Gretel hadn't been in Berlin during those final weeks. Gretel's newborn daughter, Eva Barbara, was temporarily placed in the care of relatives while Gretel was detained. The interrogations, documented in declassified American intelligence files, reveal that Gretel claimed to know very little about Hitler's political activities or military decisions, insisting that family gatherings at the Berghof focused on social matters and that Hitler deliberately kept women in his circle ignorant of state affairs. When asked about the Holocaust and concentration camps, Bertel's response was similar to other Nazi-connected women. She claimed complete ignorance, stating she had heard rumors of camps for political prisoners but knew nothing about systematic extermination. The Americans were skeptical. How could the sister-in-law of Adolf Hitler, married to an SS general, claim to know nothing about the final solution? But they found no evidence that Gretel had personally participated in crimes or held any official position, so after several months of detention, she was released in late 1945 with her daughter Eva Barbara and reunited with her parents. The family returned to their modest apartment in Munich, and Gretel faced the challenge of raising a daughter alone while carrying the triple stigma of being Eva Braun's sister, Hermann Fegerlein's widow, and potentially, though unproven, the mother of Hitler's child. What happened next reveals Gretel's strategy for dealing with this impossible legacy. Unlike Gudrun Himmler, who defended her father, or Rolf Mengele, who eventually acknowledged his father's crimes, Gretel chose a middle path of silence and withdrawal. She never gave interviews about her sister, never publicly discussed her marriage to Fegerlein, and avoided any association with neo-Nazi groups or SS veteran organizations that might have welcomed her as Eva Braun's sister. In 1954, when her daughter Eva Barbara was 9 years old, Gretel married for a second time to a businessman named Kurt Berlinghoff. She took his surname, becoming Gretel Berlinghoff, and her daughter also took the Berlinghoff name, finally escaping the Fegerlein connection that carried implications of both SS membership and potential Hitler paternity. The family lived quietly in Munich, and Gretel raised Eva Barbara to be as disconnected from her historical legacy as possible. Though the rumors about her paternity continued to circulate in sensationalist publications and among amateur historians fascinated by the idea that Hitler might have had a child. Ilse's lifelong defense and the parents who kept silent. While Gretel Braun chose silence and remarriage to escape her connection to Hitler and the Nazi regime, her older sister Ilse made a very different choice. She spent the rest of her life defending Eva's memory and insisting that her sister had been an innocent woman who knew nothing about the Holocaust and was simply devoted to the man she loved. Ilse Braun was born on November 5, 1909, making her nearly 3 years older than Eva, and unlike her younger sisters, Ilse never became deeply entangled with Hitler's inner circle. She married in 1937 to a man whose identity has been kept relatively private in historical records, and she lived in Munich, working various jobs while maintaining regular contact with her family. When Eva died on April 30th, 1945, Ilse was 35 years old, married without children, and facing interrogation by American authorities who wanted to know everything about her famous sister's relationship with Hitler. Ilse was detained briefly in May 1945, questioned extensively about Eva's life, her knowledge of Nazi crimes, and the family's relationship with Hitler, but she was released within weeks because investigators found no evidence of personal wrongdoing beyond family association. What makes Ilse's story significant is what happened in the decades after the war ended, as historians, journalists, and the German public tried to understand who Eva Braun really was and what her role in Hitler's life had been. Unlike Gretel, who avoided publicity, Ilse became Eva's primary defender, giving numerous interviews over the years in which she portrayed her sister as apolitical, naive about Nazi ideology, and completely ignorant of the Holocaust. In a 1948 interview with an American journalist, Ilse stated, "Eva loved Hitler the man, not Hitler the politician. She never attended political meetings, never discussed state matters, and Hitler kept her deliberately separated from his work. She was just a woman who wanted to be with the man she loved." This narrative of Eva as an innocent bystander to history, a woman whose only crime was loving the wrong man, became Ilse's consistent message for the next 30 years until her death in 1979. The problem with this narrative is that it's both partially true and fundamentally dishonest. Eva probably didn't participate directly in planning or implementing Nazi crimes, but she lived in luxury at the Berghof, funded by Nazi plunder. She socialized with men like Himmler and Goering, who were orchestrating genocide, and her decision to marry Hitler in the bunker and die with him suggests a level of commitment to him and his cause that goes beyond naive romance. Ilse's defense of Eva also extended to minimizing Hitler's crimes themselves, not through explicit Holocaust denial, but through subtle suggestions that the scale of atrocities had been exaggerated, or that Hitler personally hadn't known about the worst excesses committed in his name. In a 1973 interview, when asked whether Eva knew about concentration camps, Ilse responded, "There were work camps for political prisoners, yes, but the terrible things we heard about after the war, Eva knew nothing of that, and I don't believe Hitler knew either until very late." This statement, made 28 years after the war ended, and after decades of historical scholarship had documented Hitler's direct role in ordering the Holocaust, reveals either willful ignorance or deliberate distortion. Ilse maintained this position until her death on January 25, 1979, at age 69, in Munich, having spent 34 years defending her sister's memory and, by extension, minimizing Hitler's crimes. Though unlike Gudrun Himmler, Ilse never actively supported war criminals or joined neo-Nazi organizations. Eva and Gretel's parents, Fritz and Fanny Braun, took yet another approach: near-total public silence. Fritz, who had been a schoolteacher before retiring, was briefly detained by American authorities in 1945, but released quickly due to his age. He was 62 at war's end, and lack of Nazi Party membership or involvement in crimes. Fanny, who was 53 in 1945, was interrogated about what she knew of her daughter's life with Hitler, but provided little information beyond basic facts about Eva's childhood and personality. Both parents retreated into private life in Munich, lived on modest pensions, and refused almost all requests for interviews about their daughter. Fritz Braun died on January 22, 1964, at age 80, having spent 19 years living quietly with the knowledge that his daughter had married Adolf Hitler. Fanny outlived him by 12 years, dying on January 13, 1976, at age 84, and according to family members, she never spoke publicly about Eva, but privately maintained that her daughter had been a good Catholic girl who made a tragic mistake in loving the wrong man. Eva Barbara's life and the descendants who disappeared. Eva Barbara Fegelein, the daughter born to Gretel Braun just days after Hitler's death, and surrounded by paternity rumors her entire life, grew up in Munich in the 1950s and 1960s as Eva Barbara Berlinghoff after her mother's remarriage. According to fragmentary accounts from people who knew the family, Gretel made a deliberate decision to shield her daughter from knowledge of her biological father, Hermann Fegelein's SS career and execution, and certainly from any suggestion that Adolf Hitler might have been her actual father. Eva Barbara attended local schools in Munich, lived a relatively normal middle-class life, and was reportedly told sanitized versions of her family history that minimized or omitted the most disturbing connections. But maintaining such secrets in post-war Germany, where the Nazi past was increasingly discussed and documented through the 1960s and 1970s, became impossible. At some point in her teenage years or early adulthood, Eva Barbara learned the full truth about her family connections, about her mother being Eva Braun's sister, about her legal father, Hermann Fegelein, being an SS general executed for desertion, and about the persistent rumors that Adolf Hitler might be her biological father. How Eva Barbara responded to these revelations remains largely unknown because, like the Heydrich children, she maintained almost complete privacy throughout her adult life. In 1971, at age 26, Eva Barbara married and took her husband's surname, further distancing herself from both the Fegelein and Braun names, though her married name has been kept private by family request. She had children, giving Hitler's inner circle, if not Hitler himself, grandchildren who live today in 2024, now in their 50s and 60s, carrying genes connected to the Nazi regime's most intimate sphere, but living ordinary lives in modern Germany. Eva Barbara Fegelein died on March 25, 1975, at just 29 years old, from what some sources describe as suicide, though other accounts suggest natural causes or an accident, with the exact circumstances remaining unclear due to family privacy. Her early death, just 30 years after her birth in the chaos of Nazi Germany's collapse, meant she lived her entire life in the shadow of questions about her paternity and heritage that were never definitively answered. If Adolf Hitler was indeed her biological father, then his genetic line did not end in that Berlin bunker in 1945, but continues today through Eva Barbara's children, Hitler's potential grandchildren, a possibility that remains unproven but also not definitively disproven. If you'll find in this exploration of how families connected to history's darkest chapter navigate impossible legacies compelling, subscribe now for more untold stories that reveal the moral complexities of inherited guilt, silence, and the choices people make when confronting truths too terrible to fully accept. The question of Eva Barbara's paternity has been investigated multiple times by historians and journalists, most notably in the 2004s, when German researchers attempted to locate her descendants to request DNA testing that could definitively determine whether Hitler was her father. The descendants refused all requests, exercising their legal right to privacy and making clear they wanted no part in historical investigations into their family tree. This refusal is completely understandable from a human perspective. Why would anyone want to confirm they carry Adolf Hitler's DNA? But it also means the historical question remains unresolved, and likely will remain so unless descendants choose to cooperate with testing in the future. Most serious historians believe Hermann Fegelein was indeed Eva Barbara's father, that the timing of conception aligns with Gretel and Hermann's marriage, and that the Hitler paternity rumors were likely started by gossip among Hitler's associates rather than based on actual evidence. The broader Braun family continued to shrink and disappear from public view throughout the late 20th century. Gretel Braun Berlinghoff, who had remarried and tried to build a life separate from her Nazi connections, died on October 10, 1987, at age 72 in Steingarten, Bavaria. She had outlived both her sisters Ilse and Eva, her parents Fritz and Fanny, and her daughter Eva Barbara, dying as one of the last direct links to Eva Braun and Hitler's inner circle. Gretel gave only one known interview late in her life, in 1985, to a German magazine, in which she spoke briefly about her sister Eva, describing her as a simple woman who loved the wrong man, but refusing to discuss Hermann Fegelein, her daughter, or anything related to the paternity rumors.